Two brilliant botanists vanished in Alaska's wilderness without a trace, but nearly a decade later, a moose carried the clue that would finally expose the truth. What would you do if your loved one disappeared, and the only lead appeared 9 years later, on a wild animal? Dr. Sarah Kim and Dr. Maya Rodriguez were not your typical adventurers. They were meticulous scientists, each with PhDs in botany from prestigious universities. Sarah, 29, specialized in Arctic plant adaptation, while Maya, 31, was an expert in endangered flora preservation. Their friendship had blossomed during graduate school, bonded by late nights in the lab, and a shared passion for understanding how life survives in the harshest conditions on Earth. The two women had planned what they called their expedition of a lifetime, a 3-week research trip deep into Alaska's remote Chugach National Forest. Their goal was ambitious yet noble: to document and collect samples of rare alpine plants that could hold secrets to climate adaptation, plants that might one day help humanity understand survival itself. On June 15, 2014, they loaded their backpacks with scientific equipment, camping gear, and enough supplies for their planned route through one of Alaska's most isolated regions. Their families remembered them as excited, prepared, professional. Sarah's mother recalled her daughter's last words: "Mom, we might not have cell service for days, but don't worry. We know what we're doing." Maya's father, a retired park ranger himself, had taught his daughter wilderness survival from childhood. If anyone could handle Alaska's challenges, it was these two women. They had permits, satellite emergency beacons, detailed topographical maps, and years of fieldwork experience between them. But expertise means nothing when you vanish into thin air. Their planned check-in call never came. Their scheduled pickup at the remote airstrip went unanswered. By June 18, 2014, when the bush pilot arrived at the predetermined coordinates, he found nothing but empty wilderness. Sarah and Maya had disappeared without a trace. To understand what happened next, you need to know who Sarah Kim and Maya Rodriguez truly were. These weren't reckless thrill seekers or unprepared tourists. They were accomplished scientists with everything to live for. Sarah had grown up in Seattle, the daughter of Korean immigrants who owned a small flower shop. Her fascination with plants began in her mother's greenhouse, where she spent countless hours after school watching orchids bloom and learning about the delicate balance of life. By age 16, she was already corresponding with university botanists about her observations of urban plant adaptation. Her professors at the University of Washington described her as brilliant beyond her years and destined for groundbreaking research. Maya's path to botany came through her childhood in Colorado, where her park ranger father would take her on weekend hikes through the Rockies. She learned to identify wildflowers before she could properly tie her shoes. Her doctoral dissertation on high-altitude plant survival had earned national recognition and led to consulting work with the National Park Service. She was being considered for a prestigious position at the Smithsonian. The two women had met during a conference on climate change and plant adaptation in 2012. Despite their different backgrounds, they shared an identical passion: understanding how plants survive in extreme conditions. They began collaborating on research papers, spending holidays visiting each other's families, and dreaming of expeditions that would push the boundaries of botanical science. Their Alaska expedition wasn't about personal glory or adventure tourism. Climate change was rapidly altering Arctic ecosystems, and certain plant species were disappearing before scientists could study them. Sarah and Maya believed that these hardy survivors might hold genetic keys to helping other plants, and possibly crops, adapt to our changing world. Maya's younger sister Sophia remembered the night before they left. Maya was so excited she could barely sleep. She kept showing me pictures of the plants they hoped to find, talking about how this research could help feed future generations. She said it was the most important work she'd ever do. Sarah's parents had initially worried about the trip's remoteness, but their daughter's confidence was infectious. Her father later recalled, "Sarah showed us every detail of their plan: GPS coordinates, emergency procedures, backup communications. She even left us copies of their research notes in case something happened to their equipment. She was prepared for everything except. But their search for beauty in Alaska's wilderness would lead them straight into danger. Alaska's Chugach National Forest is a land that doesn't forgive mistakes. Stretching across nearly 6 million acres, it encompasses some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. Jagged peaks rise 13,000 feet into perpetually clouded skies. Ancient glaciers carve valleys so deep that sunlight barely reaches their floors. The weather can shift from calm to deadly in minutes, with temperatures dropping 40 degrees without warning. This was where Sarah and Maya chose to conduct their research. Their planned route would take them along the remote Copper River drainage, through areas where the nearest human settlement was over 100 miles away. They intended to establish base camps at specific elevation levels, systematically documenting plant life from the river valleys up to the tree-line and beyond. The bush pilot who dropped them off, Jake Morrison, had been flying into Alaska's backcountry for over 20 years. He'd seen plenty of researchers come and go, but something about Sarah and Maya impressed him. They asked intelligent questions about weather patterns, insisted on reviewing emergency procedures twice, and their gear was better organized than most military expeditions he'd supported. Those ladies knew their business, Morrison later told investigators. They had everything mapped out down to the last detail. GPS waypoints, backup navigation, redundant communication plans. If I had to bet on any scientist surviving out there, it would have been those two. The local indigenous community had their own concerns. Thomas Crow Feather, an elder from the nearest village, had encountered the women briefly when they stopped for supplies. He'd warned them about the area they were heading into. That part of the forest, it has moods, he told them. Sometimes it welcomes people. Sometimes it doesn't. You can feel it change. When it changes, you leave. You don't ask why. You don't try to wait it out. You leave. Sarah and Maya had listened politely, but their scientific training made them skeptical of such warnings. They thanked him for his concern and assured him they would be careful. What they couldn't have known was that other people had been watching them prepare for their expedition. A local man named Derek Vasquez had been hanging around the supply store, asking questions about the scientist ladies and their plans. The store owner, Helen McKenzie, remembered feeling uncomfortable about his interest. He kept asking where they were going, how long they'd be gone, whether they were carrying valuables or research equipment, she later recalled. When I asked why he wanted to know, he claimed he was thinking of offering guide services. But something felt off. Derek never guided anyone before, and he had this look in his eyes. The women's satellite communicator sent its last signal on June 16th at 3:47 p.m. from coordinates deep in the Copper River Valley. The message was routine. Day 2 camp established. Weather clear. Excellent specimens collected. Oh well. That night, a massive storm system moved through the region. Lightning split the sky, winds howled through the valleys at over 60 miles per hour, and torrential rain turned streams into raging torrents. When morning came, the forest was transformed. Rivers had changed course, landmarks had been erased, and the landscape itself seemed rearranged. But storms were common in Alaska. Sarah and Maya were prepared for weather. What happened to them in the hours after that last transmission remained a mystery that would haunt their families for nearly a decade. The next morning, their tent was empty. The fire had burned out, and their tracks simply ended. When Jake Morrison's radio call to Sarah and Maya's satellite communicator went unanswered on June 18th, he immediately contacted the Alaska State Troopers. By the time he flew back to their last known coordinates, precious hours had already passed. The scene that greeted the initial search team was eerily pristine. Their tent was still standing, guy lines properly secured despite the recent storm. Their sleeping bags were neatly arranged inside, research notes organized in waterproof containers, cooking equipment clean and stowed. Nothing appeared disturbed or ransacked, but Sarah and Maya were nowhere to be found. Within 24 hours, one of the largest search and rescue operations in Alaska's history was underway. The Alaska National Guard deployed 2 helicopters, The Civil Air Patrol contributed fixed-wing aircraft, and specialized search teams arrived from across the state. Search dogs were flown in from Anchorage, while volunteer searchers hiked in from access points 50 miles away. Sarah's parents flew in from Seattle, Maya's family from Colorado. They established a makeshift command post at the nearest ranger station, desperately coordinating with search teams and trying to understand how two experienced researchers could simply vanish. The search expanded daily. Helicopters covered hundreds of square miles, their thermal imaging cameras scanning for any sign of human life. Ground teams followed every animal trail, checked every natural shelter, explored every cave system in the region. The search dogs, trained to detect human scent even days after it was laid down, found nothing beyond the immediate campsite area. It was like they just evaporated. Lead searcher Captain Mike Hendricks later recalled, "In 30 years of search and rescue, I've never seen anything like it. People don't just disappear without leaving some kind of trail. Even if they fell in a river, we'd find equipment downstream. Even if an animal attack occurred, there would be blood evidence, torn clothing, something." The families refused to give up hope. Sarah's mother, Lynn Kim, spent 18-hour days at the command post, plotting search areas and coordinating volunteer efforts. Maya's father used his park ranger connections to bring in specialized equipment and additional searchers. Theories began to emerge among the search teams. The storm that hit on June 16th could have caused a flash flood, sweeping the women into the rapidly moving Copper River. But searchers found no evidence along the riverbanks for miles downstream. A bear attack was possible. Alaska's brown bears are massive and territorial. But again, no physical evidence supported this theory. Some searchers quietly suggested that foul play might be involved. Derek Vasquez's suspicious behavior at the supply store had been reported to authorities, and investigators confirmed he'd been in the area around the time of the women's disappearance. When questioned, Vasquez claimed he'd been hunting alone and had no knowledge of the missing botanists. His alibi was thin, but without evidence, investigators couldn't pursue the lead further. After 3 weeks of intensive searching, covering over 2,000 square miles of wilderness, the official search was suspended. The decision devastated the families but reflected a harsh reality. Alaska's wilderness had claimed the two scientists, and nature wasn't giving up its secrets. The last official report stated, despite extensive search efforts utilizing all available resources, no trace of Dr. Sarah Kim and Dr. Maya Rodriguez has been located. Based on environmental conditions and time elapsed, this case is being classified as presumed fatalities due to wilderness accident. But not everyone believed they were gone for good. In the years following the official search suspension, Sarah and Maya's disappearance became one of Alaska's most discussed unsolved mysteries. The case attracted true crime enthusiasts, conspiracy theorists, and amateur investigators who refused to accept that two intelligent scientists could simply vanish without explanation. The families never stopped searching. Sarah's parents spent their life savings hiring private investigators and organizing civilian search parties. Maya's sister Sophia took leave from her teaching job to move to Alaska temporarily, following up on every reported sighting and investigating every theory that emerged. The theories ranged from plausible to bizarre. Some suggested the women had been victims of human trafficking, kidnapped for ransom, but killed when no contact was made. Others proposed they'd stumbled upon illegal activities, drug operations, or wildlife poaching, and were eliminated as witnesses. Derek Vasquez remained a person of interest, though he was never formally charged with anything related to their disappearance. Several witnesses came forward claiming they'd seen him in the Copper River area during the time frame when Sarah and Maya vanished. A local hunting guide reported seeing Vasquez's truck parked on a Forest Service road near the women's planned route, but Vasquez insisted he was scouting locations for a future hunting trip. The investigation revealed troubling aspects of Vasquez's background. He'd been arrested twice for assault, had a history of drug-related offenses, and was known among locals as someone who didn't respect boundaries. Women in the community described feeling uncomfortable around him, though none had reported specific incidents. However, Investigators faced a crucial problem. No physical evidence connected Vasquez to the missing women. His truck showed no signs of transporting victims. His property searches revealed nothing suspicious, and his admittedly weak alibi couldn't be definitively disproven. New leads emerged regularly, each one raising hopes before ultimately leading nowhere. A hiker reported finding women's clothing near a stream 30 miles from the campsite, but DNA testing revealed it belonged to a different missing person from years earlier. Another searcher claimed to have discovered a makeshift grave, but excavation revealed only animal remains. The most heartbreaking false leads were the reported sightings. Over the years, people claimed to have seen Sarah and Maya in various locations across Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. A waitress in Juneau was certain she'd serve Maya at her restaurant. A gas station attendant in British Columbia insisted Sarah had asked for directions. Each sighting sent family members racing to investigate, only to discover cases of mistaken identity. The psychological toll on both families was immense. Sarah's father developed severe depression and had to retire early from his job. Maya's mother began suffering panic attacks whenever she heard news reports about missing persons. The not knowing was perhaps worse than confirmation of death would have been. We couldn't grieve properly because we didn't know if they were dead or suffering somewhere, needing help, Sofia Rodriguez later explained. Every phone call might be the call. Every news story might be about them. We were trapped in this horrible limbo where hope and despair existed simultaneously. Private investigators hired by the families explored every angle. They interviewed dozens of locals, analyzed satellite imagery from the time period, and even consulted psychics and mediums, anything that might provide a lead. One investigator spent months focusing on the theory that the women had discovered something valuable during their research, perhaps a significant scientific finding or evidence of illegal activities, and were killed to prevent them from reporting it. But Alaska's wilderness kept its secret sealed. The case files grew thicker with each passing year, filled with investigated leads, false sightings, and theories that couldn't be proven. The Alaska State Troopers maintained the case as an open investigation, but with no new evidence emerging, it became what law enforcement calls a cold case, still officially active but with no active leads being pursued. Local residents developed their own folklore around the disappearance. Some claimed the women had encountered something supernatural in the deep forest, spirits or creatures from indigenous legends that didn't want outsiders disturbing sacred lands. Others whispered about secret government operations or hidden military installations that the botanists might have accidentally discovered. The scientific community hadn't forgotten them either. The American Botanical Society established the Kim Rodriguez Memorial Research Grant, funding young scientists to continue the type of climate adaptation research Sarah and Maya have been passionate about. Their incomplete research notes, recovered from the abandoned campsite, were published posthumously and contributed to several important studies on Arctic plant survival. But none of these honors brought their families the closure they desperately needed. For years, the mystery remained frozen in silence, until something unbelievable surfaced. October 12, 2023. Nearly 9.5 years after Sarah Kim and Maya Rodriguez disappeared into Alaska's wilderness, Hunter Tom Kessler was tracking a massive bull moose through the dense undergrowth of the Chugach National Forest when something caught his eye. It wasn't the moose's impressive antler spread or its enormous size that made him stop and stare. It was what was tangled in those antlers. Kessler, a lifelong Alaskan with over 3 decades of hunting experience, had never seen anything like it. Wrapped around the base of the moose's left antler were strips of bright blue fabric, clearly synthetic material that had no business being in the deep wilderness. As he watched through his binoculars, something metallic glinted in the afternoon sunlight. My first thought was that some idiot had left trash in the woods, and this poor animal had gotten tangled up in it, Kessler later recalled. But the more I looked, the more I realized this wasn't random garbage. The fabric looked like it came from technical outdoor gear, the kind of stuff serious hikers and researchers use. The moose, seemingly unbothered by its unusual decoration, continued grazing. Kessler made a decision that would finally break open one of Alaska's most puzzling mysteries. Instead of taking a shot, he quietly retreated and called the Alaska State Troopers. Trooper Jennifer Walsh responded to Kessler's call with skepticism. Reports of evidence found in the wilderness were common, and most turned out to be false alarms or unrelated debris. But something in Kessler's voice convinced her to take the report seriously. He was very specific about what he was seeing. Walsh remembered. He described the fabric as definitely from expensive outdoor gear, mentioned seeing what looked like buckles or clips, and most importantly, he said the material appeared weathered but not completely degraded. That suggested it hadn't been exposed to the elements for decades. Walsh contacted the state's Fish and Wildlife Department to assist in safely approaching and potentially tranquilizing the moose. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the tight-knit law enforcement community, and soon Detective Ray Morrison, no relation to the Bush pilot, was driving north from Anchorage with a forensics team. The operation to safely examine the moose took place 2 days later. Wildlife officials used tranquilizer darts to sedate the massive animal, allowing investigators to carefully extract the tangled materials from its antlers without harming it. What they found sent shockwaves through the investigation team. The blue fabric was indeed from a high-end outdoor jacket, specifically a women's XS technical shell manufactured by Patagonia. Attached to the fabric were fragments of a climbing harness, pieces of nylon webbing, and most incredibly, a partially intact name tag that read, Rodriguez, Ph.D. Additional items recovered from the antlers included a waterproof sample collection tube of the type used by field botanists, fragments of a digital camera strap, and what appeared to be pieces of a GPS device. Detective Morrison's hand shook as he examined the name tag through an evidence bag. After nearly a decade of cold case status, the Kim Rodriguez disappearance was suddenly very active again. The condition of these items was remarkable, Morrison later testified. They showed obvious weathering and UV damage, consistent with extended exposure to outdoor elements. But they hadn't been completely destroyed, which suggested they hadn't been exposed continuously for 9 years. Something had protected them, at least partially. The forensics team worked methodically, documenting every fragment, taking photographs from multiple angles, and preparing samples for DNA analysis. Each piece of evidence was treated with irreverence due to what might be the only physical proof of what happened to the 2 missing scientists. But the biggest question wasn't what they'd found. It was how these items had ended up tangled in a wild moose's antlers, nearly a decade after their owners disappeared. Wildlife biologist Dr. Patricia Hendricks was called in to explain how such a thing could happen. Her analysis would prove crucial to understanding not just how the evidence was discovered, but what it might reveal about the fate of Sarah Kim and Maya Rodriguez. Moose antlers are shed and regrown annually, Dr. Hendricks explained. This bull's antlers would have been shed in late winter and regrown throughout the spring and summer. For fabric and equipment to become so thoroughly tangled in the antler structure, the moose would have had to come into contact with these items during the early growing season, when the antlers are still soft and covered in velvet. The implications were staggering. The moose hadn't been carrying this evidence for 9 years. It had encountered these items relatively recently, probably within the past 6 months. But where had the items been for nearly a decade before the moose found them? But how did the moose end up carrying evidence that had been lost for nearly a decade? The discovery of Maya's belongings tangled in a moose's antlers breathed new life into an investigation that had been dormant for nearly a decade. Within hours of the forensic team's preliminary findings, the Kim Rodriguez case was reassigned to Alaska's Major Crimes Unit, and families who had lived with uncertainty for 9 years suddenly found themselves thrust back into the spotlight of an active investigation. Detective Ray Morrison, now the lead investigator, faced a puzzle that was both clearer and more mysterious than before. The physical evidence confirmed what families had never wanted to accept. Sarah and Maya were almost certainly dead. But the condition and location of the recovered items raised new questions about how and where they died. Forensic analysis revealed crucial details about the recovered materials. DNA testing confirmed that the jacket fragments belonged to Maya Rodriguez, matching samples provided by her family years earlier. Microscopic analysis of the fabric showed damage patterns consistent with prolonged exposure to weather, scavenging animals, and UV radiation. But the materials hadn't been completely destroyed, suggesting they'd been protected from the elements for significant periods. The forensics team made another disturbing discovery. Tiny bone fragments were found embedded in some of the fabric fibers, fragments that preliminary analysis suggested were human. More comprehensive testing would take weeks, but the implication was clear. These weren't just belongings lost during a hiking accident. They were associated with human remains. Dr. Patricia Hendricks' wildlife analysis provided the key to understanding how decades-old evidence could suddenly appear on a living moose. Her research into moose behavior patterns revealed that the animals regularly visit what biologists call mineral licks, natural salt deposits where various animals come to supplement their diets. These licks often become repositories for organic materials as animals die nearby, and their remains are scattered by scavengers. Moose antlers grow incredibly rapidly during spring and summer, Dr. Hendricks explained to investigators. The velvet-covered growing antlers are soft and sticky. If a bull moose feeds at a mineral lick where human remains have been scattered by scavengers over the years, it's entirely possible for fabric and equipment fragments to become embedded in the growing antler material. This theory suggested that Sarah and Maya's remains had been at or near a mineral lick for years, gradually being scattered and redistributed by the natural processes of the forest. It was a grim picture, but it offered the first plausible explanation for how evidence could remain hidden for nearly a decade before suddenly reappearing. Investigators immediately began searching for mineral licks in the area where the moose had been spotted. Using GPS technology and wildlife behavior databases, they identified 3 primary locations within a 20-mile radius of where Tom Kessler had encountered the bull moose. The first 2 locations yielded nothing significant, scattered animal bones from natural deaths, but no evidence of human remains. The third location, a natural salt spring deep in a valley 12 miles from Sarah and Maya's original campsite, told a very different story. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies consistent with disturbed earth and organic decomposition. Cadaver dogs, brought in from the lower 48, immediately alerted to the presence of human remains in the area. Careful excavation began under the supervision of forensic anthropologists and crime scene investigators. What they found painted a picture that was both heartbreaking and deeply troubling. Scattered human bones, clearly weathered by years of exposure, were found throughout the mineral lick area. Initial analysis suggested remains from 2 individuals, and dental records would later confirm these belonged to Sarah Kim and Maya Rodriguez. But the distribution pattern of the bones raised disturbing questions. The remains weren't concentrated in one location, as would be expected from deaths due to accident or exposure. Instead, they were scattered across an area roughly 50 yards in diameter, some buried by natural processes, others clearly moved by scavenging animals over the years. This pattern suggested the women hadn't died at this location. Their bodies had been transported here after death. More troubling were the bone fractures discovered during analysis. Both skeletons showed evidence of trauma that occurred around the time of death, fractures inconsistent with accidental falls or animal attacks. Forensic pathologist Dr. Kenneth Liu identified what appeared to be deliberate blunt force trauma to both skulls. The fracture patterns I observed were consistent with repeated impacts from a heavy, blunt instrument, Dr. Liu reported. These are not injuries you see from falling or from typical wilderness accidents. These appear to be the result of intentional violence. The investigation had shifted from a missing persons case to a potential double homicide. Suspenseful detail. Forensic traces suggested they may not have died together. Isotope analysis of the bone material indicated that Sarah had consumed different water sources than Maya in the days before their deaths, suggesting they may have been separated before being killed, or that one survived longer than the other. If foul play was involved, who was responsible? The revelation that Sarah and Maya had likely been murdered sent shockwaves through both families and the law enforcement community. What had begun as a wilderness disappearance was now officially classified as a double homicide investigation, with the Alaska Bureau of Investigation taking the lead. Sarah's parents, now in their 70s, struggled to process the news they'd both hoped for and dreaded for nearly a decade. Finally, having confirmation of their daughter's death brought a painful kind of relief. But learning she'd been murdered opened new wounds that might never heal. For 9 years, I held on to this tiny hope that maybe they were alive somewhere, maybe suffering from amnesia or being held against their will, Sarah's mother Lynn Kim said through tears. But I also knew in my heart that Sarah would never voluntarily stay away from family. Now we know the truth, and it's somehow worse than anything I imagined. Maya's family faced the same devastating mix of closure and renewed trauma. Her sister Sophia, who had spent years investigating the disappearance, felt both vindicated and heartbroken that her suspicions about foul play had been correct. The investigation now focused intensively on Derek Vasquez, the local man who had shown suspicious interest in the women's expedition plans. Detectives re-interviewed everyone who had known him in 2014, searching for any evidence that might connect him to the murders. What they discovered painted a picture of a man with a history of violence against women and a pattern of behavior that had escalated over time. 3 women came forward with stories of Vasquez following them, making unwanted advances, and becoming aggressive when rejected. One reported that he had stalked her for months after she refused to date him. Most significantly, investigators found evidence that Vasquez had lied about his whereabouts during the critical time period. Examination of his cell phone records from 2014 showed that his phone had been active near the Mineral Lick area on June 17, the day after Sarah and Maya's last communication. But cell phone evidence from nearly a decade earlier was problematic. Vasquez's phone had pinged cell towers that covered vast areas of wilderness, and the data wasn't precise enough to place him at the exact location where the remains were found. His defense attorney argued that Vasquez had been hunting in the general area and had every right to be there. The investigation team decided to re-examine Vasquez's property with new technology and the knowledge of what they were specifically looking for. Ground-penetrating radar revealed disturbed soil in several locations on his land, and excavation uncovered a cache of items that made investigators' blood run cold. Buried beneath Vasquez's tool shed were personal items that clearly belonged to Sarah and Maya. Sarah's distinctive silver bracelet with botanical engravings, Maya's digital camera containing photos from their expedition, and most damning of all, their research notebooks detailing their planned route and daily activities. Confronted with this evidence, Vasquez initially claimed he'd found these items years earlier while hunting and had forgotten about them. But detailed analysis of the camera's timestamp data told a different story. The final photos on the device showed Sarah and Maya at their campsite on the evening of June 16th, but the camera had continued recording for several hours after their last official communication. The final images were blurry and chaotic, apparently taken during some kind of struggle or disturbance. Enhanced analysis revealed a partial image of a man's face that bore a strong resemblance to Derek Vasquez. Under intense questioning, Vasquez's story began to unravel. He admitted to having followed the women to their campsite, claiming he was only trying to offer guide services. When they rejected his advances and told him to leave, he said he became angry and things got out of hand. His confession, when it finally came, was chilling in its casualness. He described attacking both women in a rage, killing them near their campsite, then moving their bodies to the remote Mineral Lick where he thought they would never be found. He claimed it wasn't premeditated murder, just a moment of uncontrolled anger that spiraled into violence. But investigators suspected there was more to the story. The forensic evidence suggested a level of planning and deliberation inconsistent with Vasquez's claims of spontaneous violence. The systematic way the bodies had been disposed of, the careful burial of personal items, and his false alibi all pointed to premeditated murder. The families, while grateful for finally knowing the truth, struggled with the senseless nature of their daughters' deaths. These brilliant young scientists, working to better understand and protect the natural world, had been killed by a man who saw them as objects to be controlled rather than human beings deserving of respect. Emotional depth flowed through the courtroom as both families spoke about living 9 years in uncertainty. Sarah's father, his voice breaking, addressed Vasquez directly. "You didn't just kill our daughters. You stole 9 years of our lives, keeping us in agony, wondering if they were out there somewhere needing our help." Maya's mother spoke of the guilt she'd carried, wondering if she should have insisted her daughter not take the trip, if there were warning signs she'd missed, if somehow she could have prevented the tragedy. Investigators admitted the painful truth. The wilderness might hold answers, but it doesn't give them easily. If not for a chance encounter between a hunter and a moose with tangled antlers, this case might never have been solved. Sarah and Maya's families might have lived their entire lives without knowing what happened to their daughters. The natural processes that had scattered and hidden the evidence for nearly a decade had ultimately been responsible for revealing the truth. The moose that carried fragments of Maya's jacket in its antlers had unknowingly become the key witness in a case that human investigation couldn't crack. And so, the moose's haunting discovery became both the only answer and the greatest mystery of how nature itself had finally demanded justice for 2 young scientists who died pursuing their passion for understanding the natural world. Derek Vasquez was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in December 2023. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Physical items found on his property, forensic analysis linking him to the crime scene, cell phone data placing him in the area, and ultimately his own confession detailing how he had killed both women. His trial, held in Anchorage in the spring of 2024, drew national attention as one of the most unusual cold cases ever solved. The prosecution methodically presented the evidence, from the initial discovery of fabric tangled in the moose's antlers through the complex forensic analysis that finally identified the killer. Vasquez's defense team attempted to argue for manslaughter rather than murder, claiming their client had acted in a moment of passion rather than with premeditation. But the systematic disposal of the bodies and the elaborate efforts to conceal the crime convinced the jury that this was deliberate murder, not a spontaneous act of violence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on both counts of first-degree murder. Vasquez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Alaska's maximum punishment, as the state does not have the death penalty. The families finally had the closure they had sought for nearly a decade, but it came with a bittersweet recognition of everything that had been lost. Sarah would have been 38 years old at the time of the trial, likely married with children, continuing her groundbreaking research into plant adaptation. Maya would have been 40, possibly leading her own research team at a major institution, training the next generation of botanists. Their incomplete research from that final expedition was eventually completed by colleagues using the samples and notes recovered from their campsite. The work led to significant discoveries about Arctic plant adaptation that have contributed to current climate change research, a fitting legacy for 2 scientists who died pursuing knowledge that could benefit humanity. The American Botanical Society expanded the Kim Rodriguez Memorial Research Grant into a full fellowship program, sending young scientists to continue the type of fieldwork that Sarah and Maya had been passionate about. Recipients of the fellowship are required to work in teams and maintain constant communication with support staff, safety protocols that might have saved the original researchers' lives. The case also led to changes in how remote research expeditions are monitored. The Alaska State Troopers now require more frequent check-ins for permits issued in remote areas, and satellite communication technology has improved to the point where researchers can maintain almost constant contact with civilization. But perhaps the most profound impact of the case was the reminder it provided about the intersection of human predation and nature's own justice. For nearly a decade, Alaska's wilderness had kept the secret of what happened to Sarah Kim and Maya Rodriguez. The forest had buried their remains, scattered their belongings, and hidden the evidence of their murder so completely that it seemed the truth might never emerge. Yet in the end, it was nature itself that revealed the truth. A wild moose, following ancient patterns of behavior in search of mineral nutrients, had encountered the scattered remains of two young scientists. The biological processes that grow antlers had captured fragments of evidence and carried them back into the world of the living, where an experienced hunter recognized their significance. The irony was inescapable. Sarah and Maya, who had dedicated their lives to studying and understanding the natural world, were ultimately given justice by that same natural world. The moose that revealed their killer had been acting on instincts millions of years old, following patterns of behavior that the two botanists would have found fascinating to study. Lin Kim, Sarah's mother, found a strange comfort in this realization. Sarah always believed that nature had its own wisdom, its own way of maintaining balance, she said at Vasquez's sentencing hearing. Maybe this is nature's way of saying that the murder of two of its most devoted students couldn't go unpunished forever. The case raises profound questions about justice, nature, and the unpredictable ways that truth can emerge even after years of concealment. If Tom Kessler hadn't decided to report the unusual sight of fabric tangled in a moose's antlers, if he had simply taken a shot and continued hunting, Derek Vasquez might never have been caught. Two families might have lived their entire lives without knowing what happened to their daughters. The randomness of the discovery, a hunter spotting something unusual on a wild animal in thousands of square miles of wilderness, highlights how easily the truth could have remained buried forever. Yet somehow, through a chain of circumstances that seems almost miraculous, justice was finally served. Maya's sister Sophia reflected on this during the trial's conclusion. Maya always said that nature doesn't waste anything, that everything serves a purpose even if we don't understand it at the time. Maybe this moose was serving a purpose we couldn't have imagined, bringing my sister and Sarah the justice they deserved. The scientific community has grappled with the broader implications of the case. Two promising researchers were killed at the height of their careers, their potential contributions to climate science and botanical research forever lost. Their murder represents not just a personal tragedy for their families, but a loss to human knowledge and understanding. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the wildlife biologist who helped explain how evidence could be preserved and transferred by natural processes, noted the case's unique position in forensic history. This may be the first time that animal behavior and natural biological processes have been the primary means of solving a decade-old murder case. It shows us that we still have much to learn about the complex relationships between human activity and natural systems. The moose that carried the evidence has become something of a legend in Alaska. Wildlife officials have continued monitoring the bull, and it remains healthy and active in its territory. Some locals have begun referring to it as justice, though biologists prefer to maintain professional objectivity about the animal's role in the case. For the families, the resolution brought a mixture of relief, grief, and anger that will likely persist for the rest of their lives. They had spent 9 years hoping their daughters might somehow still be alive, and learning the truth meant finally accepting that hope was gone. But it also meant they could finally grieve properly, knowing what had happened, and that their daughter's killer would spend the rest of his life in prison. The memorial services held for Sarah and Maya in 2024, nearly a decade after their deaths, drew hundreds of people from around the world. Former classmates, research colleagues, family friends, and members of the scientific community gathered to celebrate lives that had been cut tragically short, but had nonetheless made meaningful contributions to human knowledge. At Sarah's memorial in Seattle, her former professor, Dr. Michael Park, no relation, spoke about her dedication to understanding how life adapts to extreme conditions. Sarah studied survival in the harshest environments on Earth, but she couldn't survive the cruelest environment of all, human evil. Yet even in death, she and Maya have taught us something about the persistence of truth and the unexpected ways that justice can emerge. Maya's memorial in Colorado featured a presentation of the research findings that had been completed using her final field notes. The discoveries about high-altitude plant adaptation have already influenced agricultural research and climate adaptation strategies. Her work lives on, contributing to the very goals she and Sarah had hoped to achieve during their final expedition. The Kim Rodriguez case has been studied by criminologists, forensic scientists, and wildlife biologists as an example of how natural processes can intersect with human justice systems in unexpected ways. It's become a case study in forensic schools and police academies, demonstrating the importance of following up on unusual discoveries and the value of interdisciplinary cooperation in complex investigations. But beyond its scientific and legal implications, the case serves as a reminder of the fragility of human life and the randomness of both violence and justice. Two young women set out to contribute to human knowledge and were murdered by a man who saw them as objects rather than people. Their killer might have escaped justice entirely, if not for a chance encounter between a hunter and a wild animal carrying evidence in its antlers. In Alaska's vast wilderness, time doesn't erase secrets, it just buries them deeper. But sometimes, through processes we don't fully understand and can't predict, those secrets find their way back to the surface. Sometimes nature itself demands that justice be served. The story of Sarah Kim and Maya Rodriguez reminds us that in our interconnected world, human actions have consequences that can ripple through natural systems in ways we never anticipate. Their murder was a tragedy that robbed the world of two brilliant minds and devastated two families. But their case also demonstrates that truth has a persistent quality. It may be buried, scattered, and hidden, but it doesn't disappear forever. What do you think happened during those final hours when Sarah and Maya encountered Derek Vasquez at their campsite? Was this truly a spontaneous act of violence? Or had Vasquez been planning to harm them from the moment he learned about their expedition? The evidence suggests premeditation, but we may never know the full truth about what transpired in those remote Alaskan woods on June 16, 2014. What would you have done in Tom Kessler's position, encountering that moose with unusual materials tangled in its antlers? Would you have recognized the potential significance, or might you have dismissed it as random forest debris? His decision to report the discovery rather than ignore it literally made the difference between justice and a crime that would have remained unsolved forever. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about the dedicated scientists working in remote locations around the world to expand human knowledge, consider supporting organizations that fund botanical and climate research. Sarah and Maya died pursuing work that could help humanity adapt to our changing world. Work that continues to this day, carried out by researchers who share their passion and dedication. Their story reminds us that behind every scientific discovery, every research paper, every advance in human understanding, there are real people taking real risks to expand the boundaries of knowledge. Some, like Sarah Chun and Maya Rodriguez, pay the ultimate price for their dedication to science and discovery. But their legacy lives on in every plant adaptation study, every climate research project, every young scientist inspired to pursue botanical research. In the end, that may be the most fitting memorial of all, ensuring that their passion for understanding the natural world continues to inspire and guide future generations of researchers. The truth about their disappearance lay hidden for nearly a decade, preserved and protected by the very wilderness they had come to study. When that truth finally emerged, carried on the antlers of a wild moose, it reminded us that nature and justice operate by their own mysterious timelines. But persistence and attention to detail can eventually bring even the most carefully hidden secrets into the light.